January 17, 1941, North Atlantic, 400 miles west of Ireland. The water was black. Not the blue-black of tropical seas or the gray-black of coastal fog, but the absolute, lightless black of the deep Atlantic in winter. Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartmann stood in the conning tower of U-96, salt spray freezing on his beard, and watched the convoy lights disappear into the western darkness. 18 merchant ships. Gone. Untouched. The hunt had failed again. Below deck, in the cramped forward compartment where 42 men breathed the same fetid air thick with diesel fumes and human sweat, the crew lay in their bunks listening to the hull creak against the pressure of depth. They had been submerged for 11 hours. The batteries were dying. The air tasted of metal and fear. Outside, somewhere in that freezing void, the destroyers circled. American destroyers now. Not British. American. And they carried something new. Hartmann descended the ladder, his boots ringing against steel. He did not speak. There was nothing to say. They had left Lorient 3 weeks earlier with iron crosses fresh on their chests, and promises ringing in their ears. The Atlantic was theirs. The wolf packs ruled these waters. Britain would starve by spring. The Führer himself had said so. But standing there in the darkness, listening to the ping of enemy sonar growing louder with each passing minute, Hartmann understood what High Command in Berlin did not yet grasp. The war they had been winning was already lost. The weapon that would break them was not a ship or a plane. It was a steel drum packed with 300 pounds of Torpex explosive, fitted with a hydrostatic pistol that could detonate at any depth from 50 to 300 feet. The Americans called it the Mark 9 depth charge. The U-boat men had another name for it. They called it der Sargdeckel. The coffin LID.to understand how completely the depth charge shattered German naval strategy in the Atlantic, one must first understand the supreme confidence with which the Kriegsmarine entered 1941. The numbers told a story of seemingly inevitable victory. In 1940, German U-boats had sunk 471 Allied merchant ships totaling over 2.1 million gross tons. British imports had fallen by 25%. Food rationing grew tighter each month in London and Liverpool. The Royal Navy, stretched across 3 oceans and hemorrhaging destroyers to Luftwaffe bombing, could not protect the convoys. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat arm, calculated that sinking 700,000 tons per month would starve Britain into surrender within a year. By December 1940, his wolf packs were approaching that target. The U-boat itself was a masterpiece of German engineering psychology. The Type 7, which comprised the majority of the Atlantic fleet, could dive to 750 feet, cruise 8,500 nautical miles, and carried 14 torpedoes. More importantly, it embodied a particular German notion of warfare, the idea that superior training, discipline, and tactical innovation could overcome numerical disadvantage. Each U-boat commander was a Ritterkreuzträger, a knight of the sea, hunting alone or in coordinated packs according to Donitz's tactical genius. They called it Ritteltaktik, wolf pack tactics. Surface at night, attack from within the convoy columns where escorts couldn't reach, submerge before dawn. British Aztec sonar could detect submerged submarines, but it was useless against surface U-boats running on diesel engines at 17 knots, faster than most convoy escorts. The crews believed absolutely in their boats and their mission. They had to. Life aboard a U-boat demanded faith that bordered on mysticism. 50 men living in a steel tube 220 feet long and 20 feet wide, no natural light, no privacy, no fresh food after the first week, sleeping in shifts because there weren't enough bunks. The air grew so foul after days submerged that matches wouldn't light. Mold grew on leather, on bread, on skin. Men developed boils and respiratory infections that never healed. But they endured because they were told they were winning, that every merchant ship sent to the bottom brought the Reich closer to victory, that Britain's surrender was a matter of months. Then America entered the war, and the mathematics of naval warfare changed overnight. The United States Navy in December 1941 possessed 3 crucial advantages that the Kriegsmarine had not anticipated. First, industrial capacity on a scale that defied European comprehension. American shipyards were already producing merchant vessels faster than U-boats could sink them, using prefabricated sections and assembly line techniques that reduced construction time from 8 months to 8 weeks. Second, technological innovation driven by academic research institutions and civilian companies operating with virtually unlimited funding. And third, a vast network of naval air stations spanning both coasts, capable of deploying long-range patrol aircraft equipped with radar and depth charges across every convoy route in the Western Hemisphere. But in early 1941, before Pearl Harbor forced American entry, U.S. naval intelligence was already studying British anti-submarine warfare reports with growing alarm. The Royal Navy had been fighting U-boats for 18 months and learning brutal lessons. The standard British depth charge, the Mark 7, was effective only if it exploded within 20 feet of a submarine's pressure hull. U-boats diving below 300 feet could usually escape damage. Attack patterns were predictable. Escorts would drop 5 charge patterns while passing over a sonar contact, but the turbulence from the explosions would then blind their astick for crucial minutes, allowing the U-boat to slip away. American naval engineers, working at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory in White Oak, Maryland, approached the problem with characteristic directness. Make the explosive more powerful. Make it sink faster. Make the detonation depth adjustable. Manufacture it in quantities that would allow escorts to blanket entire search areas rather than dropping careful patterns. The result was the Mark 9, which entered production in May 1941. It weighed 420 pounds, contained 300 pounds of Torpex, an explosive compound 50% more powerful than TNT, and could be set to detonate anywhere from 50 to 300 feet with reliable precision. More importantly, American industry could produce them at a rate of 5,000 per month. By January 1942, when U-boats began operating off the American East Coast in what they called the second happy time, every U.S. destroyer and Coast Guard cutter carried at least 60 depth charges. Within 6 months, that number would double. The killing had begun. March 15, 1942, U-85, 60 miles east of Cape Hatteras. Oberleutnant Zur C. Eberhard Gregor had been hunting merchant ships in the shallow waters off North Carolina for 11 days. His log recorded 6 vessels sunk, including 2 tankers that burned for hours, visible from shore. The patrol had been extraordinarily successful. Too successful. Gregor knew the Americans would respond. He did not know they were already above him. The USS Roper, a flush-deck destroyer of First World War vintage, had detected U-85 on surface radar at 11:40 p.m. Commander Hamilton Howe ordered silent running, all guns manned, depth charges armed. The U-boat was cruising on the surface, charging batteries, her crew likely exhausted after days of combat operations. Roper closed to 700 yards before Gregor's lookouts spotted her bow wave. Crash dive bells rang through U-85. Valves opened. The submarine's nose tilted down. She never reached safety depth. Roper opened fire with her 3-inch guns at 300 yards, shells tearing through U-85's conning tower and pressure hull before she could submerge. As the U-boat wallowed, flooding, her crew tried to abandon ship. Howe ordered depth charges released. 11. Mark 9s set for shallow detonation. The explosions lifted U-85's stern completely out of the water. The submarine broke in half and sank in 90 seconds. Of 46 men aboard, 29 died in the water from injuries or hypothermia. The survivors, pulled from the oil-slicked ocean at dawn, could not comprehend the speed and violence of their destruction. They had expected a surface gun battle, a fighting chance. Instead, they had been obliterated by explosives they never saw, dropped from a ship they barely had time to identify. U-85 was the first German submarine sunk by American forces in U.S. waters. She would not be the last. By June 1942, the second happy time was over. 8 U-boats had been destroyed along the eastern seaboard. 12 more had been damaged and forced to abort patrols. The survivors who returned to Lorient and Brest brought stories that chilled even the most veteran commanders. The Americans, they said, dropped depth charges the way other navies fired machine guns, constantly, overlapping, in patterns that left no escape route. One U-boat captain reported counting 47 explosions during a single attack run. The pressure waves shattered gauges, cracked battery casings, drove rivets through the hull like bullets. Men went mad from the concussive force. The psychological impact of depth-charge warfare on U-boat crews cannot be overstated. Unlike surface combat, where a sailor could see the enemy and fight back, depth charging reduced experienced warriors to helpless victims. A submerged U-boat under attack could do nothing but run silent, rig for depth charges, and wait. The crew would hear the destroyer's propellers overhead, a sound like tearing cloth amplified through the hull. Then silence. Then the explosions. Each detonation produced three distinct effects. First, the concussive shockwave, traveling at 5,000 feet per second through seawater, struck the hull like a massive hammer blow. Men standing were thrown to the deck. Light bulbs shattered. Instruments flew from their mounts. Second, the pressure wave that followed, squeezing the hull, testing every weld and rivet. Cork insulation would burst from the bulkheads in clouds of white dust. Steel plates groaned. Leaks appeared at pipe joints. Third, the psychological assault. The knowledge that the next explosion might be close enough to crack the pressure hull, to flood the boat in seconds, to condemn 50 men to death by drowning or crushing pressure in absolute darkness 300 feet below the surface. The U-boat service developed elaborate rituals to combat this terror. Commanders would pass through the boat during attacks, calmly smoking cigarettes, making jokes, demonstrating confidence. Veteran sailors taught new crew members to breathe slowly, to focus on small tasks, checking gauges, monitoring depth, anything to keep the mind occupied. Some men prayed. Others recited poetry. A few simply stared at the bulkheads, counting explosions, waiting for the one that would kill them. And the attacks were constant. By mid-1942, the U.S. Navy had implemented hunter-killer groups, dedicated anti-submarine task forces built around escort carriers with supporting destroyers, equipped with the latest radar and sonar technology. These groups didn't wait for U-boats to attack convoys. They hunted proactively, using radio intercepts and high-frequency direction finding to locate U-boats, then prosecuting contacts relentlessly. A typical attack pattern involved 4 destroyers working in coordination, each dropping 24 depth charges in overlapping patterns, filling a cubic mile of ocean with explosive force. U-boats caught by these groups rarely escaped. Between June and December 1942, hunter-killer groups accounted for 68 U-boat kills in the Atlantic. November 3, 1942, U-132, Bay of Biscay. Captain Lieutenant Ernst Vogelsang had survived 11 war patrols. He had sunk 23 ships. He held the Iron Cross, First Class, and the U-boat War Badge with diamonds. He was 28 years old, and he knew he was going to die. U-132 had been caught on the surface by a Royal Canadian Air Force Hudson bomber carrying 4 depth charges. The first attack had damaged the diving planes and ruptured fuel tanks. Vogelsang had no choice but to run for port on the surface, trailing diesel oil, hoping to reach the protection of Luftwaffe air cover before another aircraft found him. He did not make it. The destroyer HMS Crocus intercepted U-132 40 miles west of La Rochelle. Vogelsang tried to dive anyway, knowing the boat would never reach safety depth, knowing his crew would die slowly as seawater flooded the compartments. But he tried because that was what U-boat commanders did. They tried. Crocus dropped her first pattern of 8 depth charges at 400 yards. The explosions buckled U-132s after diving tanks and blew her stern to the surface. Vogelsang ordered the boat surfaced, and the crew to abandon ship. 26 men made it out before Crocus's guns found the range. The destroyer's 4-inch shells tore through the conning tower, the pressure hull, the engine room. U-132 sank by the stern in 7 minutes. Vogelsang went down with his boat. His body was never recovered. The survivors, including the first watch officer who watched his captain die, were taken to prisoner of war camps in Canada. British intelligence officers interrogated them extensively, not about military secrets, but about their experiences under depth charge attack. What the interrogators learned disturbed them. These were not broken men. They were traumatized. They flinched at loud noises. They couldn't sleep. They wept when asked to describe attacks. Several required psychiatric treatment. The weapons designed to destroy submarines were also destroying the minds of the men who crewed them. By 1943, the depth charge had evolved from a tactical weapon into a strategic instrument that fundamentally altered the Battle of the Atlantic. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. In 1942, Allied forces had sunk 87 U-boats. In the first 5 months of 1943, they sank 96. German shipyards could build 20 U-boats per month. The Allies were destroying them at twice that rate. Even more critically, experienced crews were being lost faster than they could be replaced. A U-boat commander in 1940 averaged 6 war patrols before death or capture. By 1943, that number had fallen to 2. The Americans had achieved something the British had struggled to accomplish. They had made U-boat operations economically unviable. It wasn't enough to sink submarines. Every U-boat forced to abort patrol, every crew too damaged psychologically to return to sea, every commander who hesitated to press an attack because he feared depth charges more than he feared failure, these were strategic victories. The depth charge created a calculus of terror that undermined German naval effectiveness even when the weapons missed their targets. Admiral Donitz, watching his monthly loss reports climb past sustainable levels, understood what was happening but could not stop it. German industry could not match American production. German technology, despite desperate innovations like the snorkel-breathing tube and acoustic torpedoes, could not overcome American numerical superiority. And most devastatingly, German morale could not withstand the psychological grinding of depth-charge warfare. U-boat crews called it der Würgegriff, the stranglehold. Every patrol became a countdown to death. Men volunteered for U-boat service at decreasing rates. Some experienced commanders requested transfer to surface vessels or shore duty, preferring combat where they could fight back to the helpless horror of depth-charge attacks. The symbolic power of the depth charge extended beyond its tactical effectiveness. To the Germans, the U-boat represented modern warfare at its most sophisticated: technology, training, and courage combined in a single weapon system that could challenge a vastly superior enemy. The depth charge, by contrast, represented brute force. It was simple, mass-produced, indiscriminate. It required no particular skill to deploy. Destroyers simply had to get close enough and drop enough explosives into the water. It was, in German eyes, a typically American weapon, overwhelming quantity compensating for lack of finesse. But that assessment missed the essential truth. The depth charge worked precisely because it was simple and mass-produced. Complex weapon systems are vulnerable to supply disruptions, require specialized training, demand constant maintenance. The Mark 9 depth charge required none of these. A minimally trained crew could load and deploy them. They didn't break. They didn't malfunction. They simply sank and exploded, again and again, thousands of times per month, across every contested ocean in the world. American industrial democracy had created a weapon that perfectly embodied its values: practical, reliable, available in such quantities that quality became almost irrelevant. May 24, 1943, U-boat bunker, Lorient, France. The concrete walls were 40 feet thick, designed to withstand any bomb the British could drop. Inside, in the dry docks, U-boats underwent repair and refit under artificial light that never dimmed. The crews lived in the bunker between patrols, sleeping, eating, existing in a timeless space where the war outside became abstract. But even here, surrounded by 10,000 tons of reinforced concrete, the men could not escape what they had experienced. Corvettenkapitän Hans-Joachim Krug, flotilla commander, walked through the crew quarters conducting informal inspections. What he saw disturbed him more than any casualty report. Men in their early 20s with the faces of exhausted veterans. Sailors who jumped at sudden noises. Whole crews that sat in silence, smoking, staring at nothing. The official term was Kriegsmarine, war weariness. Krug had a simpler name for it. These men were afraid, and they had reason to be. The latest intelligence from Berlin made grim reading. In May alone, 38 U-boats had been sunk. More than one per day. The Allies were now deploying escort carriers with every major convoy, providing continuous air cover across the entire Atlantic. American-built destroyer escorts, simpler and cheaper than fleet destroyers but carrying the same depth charge capacity, were entering service at a rate of 50 per month. RAF Coastal Command had equipped its long-range bombers with centimetric radar that could detect surface U-boats in total darkness through clouds. There was nowhere left to hide. Krug drafted a memorandum to High Command that evening. The morale crisis among U-boat crews has reached critical levels. Men are reporting for patrol duty physically capable but psychologically compromised. The depth charge attacks have created a fear response that training cannot overcome. We are losing boats not to enemy action but to crew failures, commanders who hesitate, watch officers who panic, sailors who freeze at critical moments. The weapon itself may be less significant than its psychological impact. The memorandum was forwarded through channels. It reached Admiral Donitz's headquarters. It was read, noted, and filed. The operational reality remained unchanged. U-boats continued sailing from French ports on patrols from which many would not return. Crews continued volunteering, though now they were younger, less trained, more likely to make fatal mistakes. The wolf packs that had terrorized the Atlantic in 1940 had become increasingly desperate prey. The turning point came in what naval historians call Black May. Between May 1st and May 24, 1943, German U-boats sank only 34 merchant ships in the North Atlantic. In the same period, 41 U-boats were destroyed. The mathematics were unsustainable. On May 24, Donitz ordered all U-boats withdrawn from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The decision was presented as a tactical redeployment. In reality, it was an admission of defeat. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had raged for 4 years and cost thousands of lives on both sides, was effectively over. Germany had lost. The depth charge had not won the battle alone. Long-range patrol aircraft, escort carriers, improved sonar, broken German codes, American shipbuilding capacity, all these factors contributed to Allied victory. But the depth charge was the weapon that made victory inevitable. It was the weapon that transformed U-boat warfare from a sustainable campaign into a death sentence. It was the weapon that broke the morale of the Kriegsmarine's most elite service. And it was the weapon that demonstrated a fundamental truth about industrial warfare. Sometimes the simplest solution, deployed in overwhelming quantity, is the most effective. German naval archives captured after the war contained thousands of patrol reports detailing depth charge attacks. Reading them today provides insight into the experience of men caught in the stranglehold. One report, from U-221 after an attack by the destroyer USS Bory in October 1943, describes 15 minutes under continuous depth charge bombardment. 78 explosions counted. Hull rivets failing in forward torpedo room. All depth gauges destroyed. Chlorine gas from cracked batteries. Crew praying aloud. Impossible to maintain discipline under such conditions. Another report, from U-415, describes a different horror. Surface attack by American destroyer escort. Attempted crash dive. Depth charges detonated at 50 feet, while boats still diving. Force of explosion lifted stern completely clear of water. Boat fell back, landed on nose. Bow section crumpled. 6 men in forward compartment killed instantly by pressure wave. Remainder of crew evacuated after surfacing. Commander wounded by shrapnel, died during evacuation. 28. Survivors rescued by American crew. They were professional and courteous. One sailor shared his chocolate ration. That last detail, the American sailor sharing chocolate with a rescued enemy, captures something essential about the asymmetry of the Atlantic War. German U-boat crews were fighting on starvation rations, wearing the same clothes for weeks, existing in conditions that would be considered intolerable by any peacetime standard. American destroyer crews slept in bunks with mattresses, ate hot meals 3 times daily, received mail and Coca-Cola and cigarettes through an unbroken supply chain that stretched back to industrial cities that had never been bombed. The depth charge was simply the most visible manifestation of this disparity. America could afford to drop tens of thousands of 300-pound explosive charges into the ocean because American industry could produce them faster than they could be used. Germany could barely keep its existing U-boats supplied with torpedoes. April 30, 1945, Flensburg, northern Germany. Admiral Donitz stood in his temporary headquarters and read the final casualty reports of the U-boat war. The numbers told a story of organizational annihilation. Of 1,162 U-boats commissioned during the war, 785 had been destroyed. Of 40,900 men who served in the U-boat arm, 28,000 had died and 5,000 had been captured. A casualty rate of approximately 75%, higher than any other military service in any nation during the Second World War. Higher than Bomber Command, higher than the Waffen-SS, higher than the Japanese kamikaze pilots. The U-boat service had been systematically destroyed, and the weapon that had broken it was a steel drum full of explosives dropped from the sterns of American destroyers. Donitz had known the war was lost for 2 years. He had known since Black May, since the withdrawal from the North Atlantic, since the day he realized that German U-boats were sinking fewer Allied ships per month than American shipyards could launch per week. But he had continued sending men to sea because that was what naval commanders did. They followed orders. They maintained discipline. They sacrificed their crews on the altar of strategic necessity. Now, with Germany collapsing and the war entering its final days, he was forced to confront what those sacrifices had achieved: nothing. The U-boat campaign had delayed but not prevented the buildup of American forces in Britain. It had cost the Allies tonnage and lives but had not brought Britain to starvation. It had forced the diversion of Allied resources to escort duty, but not enough resources to change the strategic balance. In the end, the U-boat war had been a costly failure that had consumed Germany's most skilled naval personnel in exchange for temporary disruption of Allied logistics. The Americans, of course, saw the campaign differently. To them, the Battle of the Atlantic represented industrial democracy's triumph over totalitarian aggression. American shipyards had built 2,700 Liberty ships and hundreds of escort vessels. American factories had produced over 100,000 depth charges. American training programs had created thousands of destroyer and escort crews. American scientists had developed radar, sonar, and weapons systems that gave the Allies decisive tactical advantages. And all of this had been accomplished while simultaneously fighting a massive war in the Pacific, supplying the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, and maintaining the highest standard of living of any combatant nation. The depth charge, in this narrative, was simply one tool among many that American efficiency had deployed to solve a strategic problem. Both interpretations contained truth. The depth charge had been devastatingly effective, but only because it was deployed as part of a comprehensive anti-submarine warfare system supported by massive industrial capacity. The psychological impact on German crews had been severe, but that impact only mattered because U-boats were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. The weapon itself was simple, even crude, but simplicity was an advantage when the strategic goal was to produce and deploy as many weapons as quickly as possible. The final symbolic moment of the depth charge's dominance came on May 7, 1945, 3 days after Donitz had become head of the German government following Hitler's suicide. The last operational U-boat patrol in the Atlantic, U-2336, was running submerged off the coast of Norway when her commander received the order to cease hostilities and surface. Oberleutnant Zur Emil Klusmeyer brought his boat to the surface for the last time, ran up the black flag of surrender, and waited for British destroyers to arrive. The escort that found U-2336 was HMS Redmill, a River-class frigate armed with 60 depth charges. Her captain approached the surrendered U-boat cautiously, unsure whether the ceasefire was genuine or a trick. His crew stood at battle stations, depth charges ready to roll. The two vessels circled each other for 30 minutes before a signal lamp from U-2336 confirmed the surrender. Redmill's captain ordered his crew to stand down. The depth charges were not needed. The war was over. Clusmere and his crew were taken aboard Redmill as prisoners. British sailors escorted them below deck, where hot food and coffee were waiting. One German sailor, seeing the quantities of food available on a mere escort frigate, fresh bread, canned meat, real coffee, began to cry. He had not realized how completely Germany had been defeated until that moment, when the evidence of Allied abundance confronted him in the form of a simple meal. Another sailor asked his guard why the British had so many depth charges. The guard, a 19-year-old from Liverpool who had joined the Navy in 1943 and had never seen combat, shrugged. "We've got loads of them," he said. "More than we could ever use. The Yanks keep sending them." That exchange, recorded in Redmill's deck log, captured the essential truth of the Atlantic War's conclusion. Germany had fought with skill, courage, and tactical innovation. The Kriegsmarine's U-boat commanders had been among the most professional and effective naval officers of the war. Their crews had endured conditions that would have broken lesser men. But they had fought against an enemy that could afford to be wasteful, that could drop thousands of depth charges without concern for cost, that could lose hundreds of merchant ships and simply build more, faster than they were sunk. The depth charge, unglamorous and unsophisticated, had been the perfect weapon for such an enemy. It required no genius to deploy, no particular courage to use. It simply worked, reliably, repeatedly, in quantities that overwhelmed German ability to resist. The historical impact of the depth charge extends beyond the Battle of the Atlantic. The weapon established principles of anti-submarine warfare that remain valid today: the importance of coordinated search patterns, the effectiveness of saturation attacks, the psychological value of persistent pressure. Modern anti-submarine weapons are far more sophisticated, using acoustic homing, nuclear depth charges, and guided torpedoes. But the fundamental concept remains unchanged: find the submarine, get above it, and deliver explosive force with sufficient density to destroy or damage the target. More significantly, the depth charge campaign demonstrated the strategic value of simple, mass-produced weapons in industrial warfare. Military planners studying the Battle of the Atlantic learned that technological sophistication is not always an advantage. Sometimes the best weapon is the one that can be manufactured quickly, deployed easily, and used by minimally trained personnel. This lesson influenced American military doctrine throughout the Cold War and beyond. The AK-47, the RPG-7, the M2 Browning machine gun, all these weapons share the depth charge's essential characteristic. They are simple enough to be produced in vast quantities and reliable enough to remain effective despite minimal maintenance. For the men who served in U-boats, the depth charge remained a source of trauma long after the war ended. Veterans associations in Germany published memoirs throughout the 1950s and 1960s containing detailed descriptions of depth charge attacks. Many former U-boat sailors suffered what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Sleep disturbances, anxiety, hypervigilance, the psychological wounds of depth charge warfare persisted for decades. Some men could never again swim in deep water. Others developed claustrophobia so severe they couldn't ride in elevators. A few committed suicide, unable to escape memories of explosions in darkness, of seawater flooding through cracked hulls, of comrades screaming as the boat sank beneath them. The American destroyer crews who had dropped those depth charges generally did not share this trauma. For them, anti-submarine warfare had been a job, dangerous but manageable, conducted in relatively comfortable conditions against an enemy they rarely saw. They had hunted U-boats using radar and sonar, dropped patterns of depth charges according to established procedure, and occasionally witnessed the results: oil slicks, debris, survivors in the water. But they had not experienced the terror of being hunted, the helplessness of waiting for death 300 feet below the surface. The asymmetry of experience mirrored the asymmetry of industrial capacity. America could afford to fight the Atlantic War at a distance, using technology and quantity to minimize risk to its personnel. Germany could not. In the end, The story of how depth charges broke the U-boat offensive is a story about the nature of modern warfare. It is not a story of heroism, though there was heroism on both sides. It is not a story of tactical genius, though skilled commanders made crucial decisions. It is a story about industrial capacity meeting strategic necessity, about simple tools deployed with overwhelming force, about the psychological impact of weapons that reduce warfare to its most primitive form, explosive force applied indiscriminately until the enemy is destroyed or surrenders. The German U-boat commanders who trusted in their boats, in their training, in the sophistication of their tactics, were not wrong to do so. By any reasonable military standard, they were winning in 1940 and early 1941. But they were fighting an enemy that did not need sophisticated tactics, that could afford to trade quantity for quality, that possessed industrial resources so vast that the loss of individual weapons or even individual battles was strategically irrelevant. The depth charge dropped in thousands from the sterns of hundreds of destroyers across millions of square miles of ocean, broke the U-boat offensive not through brilliance but through persistence. It was a weapon that embodied American abundance, American industrial democracy, American willingness to solve problems through application of overwhelming resources. And it worked. By mid-1943, the Atlantic was effectively closed to German submarines. Convoys sailed with minimal losses. The buildup of American forces in Britain proceeded without significant disruption. The strategic bombing campaign intensified. The invasion of Europe became inevitable. All because simple steel drums full of explosives, dropped from ships crewed by American sailors eating hot meals and drinking Coca-Cola, proved more effective than the most sophisticated submarines in the world crewed by the most dedicated warriors Germany could produce. The final irony is that Admiral Donitz, architect of the U-boat campaign, survived the war and lived until 1980. He wrote his memoirs, gave interviews, attended veterans' reunions. He never publicly acknowledged that the U-boat war had been unwinnable, that depth charges and Allied industrial capacity had made German victory impossible. To admit this would have been to admit that 28,000 of his men had died for nothing, that their courage and skill and sacrifice had been rendered meaningless by America's ability to produce weapons faster than Germany could use them. So he maintained, until his death, that the U-boat campaign had been strategically sound, that only the intervention of American industrial capacity had prevented German victory, that under different circumstances the outcome might have been different. He was right in a sense. Under different circumstances, if America had not entered the war, if American shipyards had not outproduced German submarines, if American factories had not manufactured 100,000 depth charges, the outcome might indeed have been different. But those circumstances were never possible. The depth charge broke the U-boat offensive because America could afford to break it, because industrial democracy provided resources that totalitarian aggression could not match, because in the end, modern warfare is decided not by courage or skill but by capacity and will. The U-boat men learned this truth in the darkness 300 feet below the North Atlantic, listening to the destroyers circling overhead, counting the seconds before the next explosion, understanding too late that they had trusted in weapons and tactics when the real war was being fought in shipyards and factories they would never see.